Hi everybody, I want to set you up now for the third module, and this is going to take us through the 19th and 20th centuries. Recall that we did the 18th century, and in the 18th century we saw the key story there was of enlightenment and of the questions people were asking about how to organize a society, how to govern ourselves, what is the nature of human nature, and how do human beings relate to the natural world. We saw too that for all of the rhetoric and philosophy that was going on, there was a very real process at work as well, and that was the disenclavement and expropriation of people from West Africa and other parts of the world to create a labor pool of slaves. At the same time, Europeans in particular, were transforming the ecosystems of the Caribbean and the southern United States, and creating massive sugar plantations, rice and cotton as well. These transformations lead ultimately to industrialization. There is essentially an energy crisis in the late 18th century in which there's no longer enough energy around in the form of animal and human labor, and some other prime mover or motive force is necessary. This results in coal mining and the creation of steam engines. Steam engines power factories, as do water wheels, and create massive industrial centers. With the creation of massive industrial centers, both large factories and large cities that house these factories, and with all of the burning of coal and the mining of coal to power them, people are beginning to see that the future is not really as nice as they might have hoped. And in particular, they recognize that their work life has changed. Work had been something that one did at home or did on the farm, did with perhaps friends and family, and I don't want to over-romanticize this pre-industrial work life, but it certainly was a life in which the workers, as groups of workers, had a significant amount of control over the work process. They could decide how much work was being done, who was doing what kind of work, how much production was being, how much stuff was being produced, how much production there was. Seeing the rise of these industrial cities, seeing the rise of industrialization, workers and thinkers like Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels argue that, in fact, it's not just Equiano and his brethren that are slaves, but in fact, all of the working class are becoming slaves. Just as Equiano was expropriated, or his body was taken from West Africa, these new kinds of workers, seeing their labor now controlled by overseers, by managers, by owners, and manipulated to fit the logic of the machine, to fit the logic of mechanized production, they see themselves now as wage slaves. They are not owned by an individual person, but are in fact owned by an entire class of people, namely the capitalists or bourgeoisie. And in fact, the Lowell mill girls, the Lowell workers in Lowell, Massachusetts, talked about themselves as wage slaves. We can trace the term wage slave further back. Certainly Karl Marx and his pal Friedrich Engels argued that in some ways these wage slaves were worse off than actual slaves, people like Equiano. And I'll read you a quick quote from Friedrich Engels on this condition. Engels said, "The slave is sold once and for all. The proletarian, meaning the worker, must sell himself daily and hourly. The individual slave, property of one master, is assured an existence, however miserable it may be, because of that master's interest." In other words, the master is not going to kill the slave because he has value. The individual proletarian, the individual worker, property, as it were, of the entire bourgeois class, which buys his labor only when someone has a need of it and has no secure existence. In other words, whereas the slave at the very least had one owner who was responsible for him or her, The proletarian, the worker, had none and was therefore worse off, working in just the same ways that the slave was, but without any of the protections that slavery afforded. It's interesting to note that pro-slavery forces in the United States made this same argument, and their argument was, look, slaves are better off than these workers up north who are toiling in these factories. Now, what these thinkers of the 19th century, people that put forward revolutions in Europe in the 1840s and later through the early 20th century, places like Germany and Russia, people that pushed forward these ideas were saying to us, look, let's stop talking about grand ideas like freedom and glory, etc. But let's talk about what actually matters. Who actually makes the stuff that we actually need to live? Who makes clothing? Who makes housing? Who produces energy? And let's talk about who has control over that production. Once we begin to understand that, we'll begin to understand the historical process. We'll begin to understand what's really going on in the political and social and cultural world around us. So what does all this have to do with the Battleship Potemkin? The Battleship Potemkin is a film put out in 1925 by Sergei Eisenstein for Moscow Film, essentially the Russian or Soviet film arm, the propaganda arm of the Soviet Union. It is a film glorifying the Russian Revolution, and allegedly the Battleship Potemkin was the site of the very first step in that revolution. In fact, the Battleship Potemkin was the site of a mutiny in which the sailors on board the ship revolted or mutinied against the officers and captain and took over the ship, and that's the subject of the film. I want you to understand that this is a very real event, although it is romanticized and turned into propaganda by Eisenstein. But it's also an event that's repeated, for example, as I say, in Germany, where sailors revolted, creating really the end of the First World War and the end of the German government that was fomenting that war or prosecuting that war. So I want you to see these sailors essentially becoming members of the proletariat. Now remember that Equiano was himself a sailor, and that being a sailor is kind of a specialized job. People who are sailors have a brethren or a cohort of sailors that they share an awful lot of skill and sensibility with. What these sailors on board the Potemkin are doing is giving that up in a sense and becoming not sailors but workers, proletariat. And with them are all of the people of the city of Odessa. The other thing I want you to know is that this is an incredibly important film in the history of film and in the history of media. This is the beginning of the very concept of montage, filmic montage. It is a very new way of telling a story, and Eisenstein is credited with creating perhaps one of the most important films of all time. Pay attention, particularly in the first scenes, to the way masculinity is represented, the different representations of the working men and of the officers. Pay attention as well to the role of the church, of religion in this film. And then as we move to the Odessa steps, I want you to especially pay attention to the way the story is told. How is that film put together? Okay, enjoy watching it, and I'll see you soon. Bye-bye.